Okay, everyone, welcome back. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Eric at the Zoom phone, megaphone, whatever we should call it, who will introduce Terry Greene, who's the moderator for our next panel. And as I said, we go from one crisis, the pandemic, to an even bigger, well, maybe it's not a bigger one, it's an equally tough one, which is the crisis in the border. Eric, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. As Stephen mentioned, our final session takes up the ever-present topic of immigration reform. America's policies on immigration intersect with the American criminal justice system in many ways, creating an entire discipline, what is often referred to as crimmigration. This involves not only the criminal law enforcement of immigration laws, but also the consequences of criminal adjudication for immigration status. We're fortunate today to have to lead our discussion Terry Greene Sterling. She is a journalist, author, and teacher who has a long written about the people, policies, and landscapes of the borderlands. A fluent Spanish speaker, Professor Greene Sterling was a staff writer for the Phoenix New Times for 14 years. Her bylines have also appeared in leading publications like the Washington Post, Newsweek, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. She's the author of several books, including the 2010 narrative work, Illegal: Life and Death in Arizona's Immigration War Zone. And then her just released book, I believe this today, maybe, or close to today, Driving While Brown. A three-time Journalist of the Year here in Arizona. She has received more than 50 international and national and regional journalism awards. Here at ASU, Professor Greene Sterling is writer-in-residence and affiliated faculty at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where she has taught narrative journalism for nearly 2 decades and directs the Borderlands digital reporting team for the Cronkite News team. It is my pleasure to introduce Terry Greene Sterling. Professor Greene Sterling, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric, and welcome to this remarkable panel of scholars and experts. I would like to say that I am familiar with the work of many of you and that I view you as truth tellers and trusted sources as a journalist, and it's just a tremendous honor to be with you today. The presentations today will follow a narrative arc. First, we will learn about past mistakes in immigration reform and take a look at past and current immigration statistics. And from there, we'll learn about current immigration reform legislation now before Congress and how it will or will not impact mass migration. After that, we'll delve into misinformation about how immigrants impact crime and how this misinformation factors into the immigration reform debate. And finally, we'll learn about advocacy and proposed reforms centering on something that really fascinates me as a journalist, ICE enforcement inside the country. Each panelist will speak for 10 minutes, after which we will devote 20 minutes to answering your questions. So here we go. Our first speaker is Robert Warren. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you.
For 34 years, Bob was a demographer with the United States Census Bureau and the agency once known as the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS. He also worked with the Immigration Statistics staff of the National Academy of Sciences. Journalists who cover immigration often cite his very well-known statistical studies on the unauthorized immigrant population. Mr. Warren has testified before Congress concerning the numbers of undocumented immigration, the estimation of undocumented immigration, and served as an expert witness for the Department of Justice regarding the education of undocumented children. He has been the United States representative at the United Nations meetings on immigration statistics and has been an advisor to the United States Commission on Agricultural Workers. He holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Education from Indiana State University. Today, Bob will help us understand the biggest changes in undocumented migration in the past 25 years He will help us also understand errors within the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, and will predict for us the numbers of immigrants likely to apply for a full legalization program today. Okay, Bob, it's all yours. Can't wait to hear what you have to say.
I appreciate it. The one thing you left off of my biography there was that I was a professional baseball player with the Chicago White Sox minor leagues. And it was that failure that led me into this field a long, long time ago. When IRCA was enacted, I was the head of the statistics division of the immigration of the INS, which is a job comparable to arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. If you know anything about the old INS. Our office was given the job of estimating the number of people who would come forward in each state to apply for legalization under IRCA. We did a pretty good job. The methods weren't very good back in those days, but we made pretty good predictions of how many people might apply. It was a very good program that legalized about 3 million people, but there were shortcomings. And if we don't pay attention to these, we might repeat them. For example, probably the biggest shortcoming of IRCA was the employment verification system. That was supposed to stop undocumented immigration. It was the first time that employers would no longer be allowed to hire undocumented workers. And the problem was that there was no secure identification system, so it basically didn't work. The second problem that I don't know if I've seen anybody else bring this up, but it's because I'm a demographer. It turns out that farm workers who work in the field in agriculture are almost all age 20 to 30. That's mostly the people who work in agriculture. And so IRCA legalized the agricultural worker population. But then 10 years later, the people who were 20 to 29 were all undocumented because those people who got legalized were now 30 to 40. So IRCA had a provision for replacement workers, but as far as I know, it really was never put into effect. The third problem that I see with IRCA is has to do with the registry date. And I'm not sure if everybody understands what that is. What that means is if you've been in the country for a certain number of years, let's say 15 years, you're allowed to apply for legal status. That policy was in our immigration law for about 100 years. So when IRCA was enacted in 1986, they set the registry date at 1972. And in the past, that had been moved up about every 15 years. And the number of years you had to be in the country was about 15 years. But since then, they've never moved the registry date up. And if they had, our undocumented population would be about half of what it is now. So they need to seriously think about the registry date and implementing that. The fourth thing, which is dear to me, is that not nearly enough data were collected during IRCA. They didn't really collect enough information on the social and economic aspects of the population to know very much about it. I think, well, a little known fact about IRCA is the fact that about 2/3 of the population that could have applied came forward, which means the population was about 5 million during that time, and about 3 million applied. And you might say, well, why didn't they all apply? And I don't know. My theories are that it had to do with cost. Some were planning to go home, and other people feared the government. And I'm afraid with the anti-immigrant rhetoric over the last 5 years, that last factor might increase some. So anyway, moving on to today, we need to keep all those things in mind. And here are, moving to the present day, the population estimates that we recently published for 2019, we think there are 10.3 million undocumented immigrants in the country now. The top 5 states are California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. They make up about 57% of the total. The top 5 countries are Mexico, which has about half the number, almost half the number. El Salvador, Guatemala, India, and Honduras. Those 5 countries make up about 70% of the population. If I were betting, I would predict that about 7 million would come forward if we had a legalization program. There are 3 facts that I've known and that I haven't been able to get out to the world for a few years. And those 3 facts could have changed history had they been well known 5 years ago. In fact, sometimes I tell my wife that I'm responsible for Donald Trump because I didn't get these numbers out to the world. But here's what they are. Undocumented immigration dropped by 80% from Mexico from the year 2000 to 2010. I'll say that again. Undocumented migration from Mexico dropped by 80% in that 10-year period between 2000 and 2010. And the reason was that we doubled the Border Patrol twice during that period of time. And conditions improved in Mexico. There were probably a lot of reasons, but that was a huge drop. The second bit of information is that since 2010, 2 out of every 3 undocumented immigrant has arrived by air. I think most people are catching up with that statistic now. Most people realize that that's true. And the fact that overstays are so much higher than arrivals across the border is not because overstays have increased a lot. It's because overstays drop so far below overstays. Yeah, because those who entered without inspection drop a lot more than overstays. The third fact that I wish everyone knew is that the total undocumented population has dropped by 1.5 million this decade. So the fact is, we have a crisis at the southern border because of asylum, how we handle asylum claims. Otherwise, undocumented immigration has been far less of a problem in the last 10 years than it has been for 40 or 50 years. And I want to stop now because I want to give you a source of what I consider to be very good information about the undocumented population. And the website, which I've given out before at the beginning of my presentation, and I've lost my audience. But this, you should make a note of this website. It's data.cmsny.org. And what you'll find there is when you click on that, you'll find a map of the US. It has every state. And if you click on a state, you will get undocumented immigrants in that state, total number. And you'll get information about continent of origin, the top countries, period of entry, years in the US, age arrived, language spoken at home, ability to speak English, school enrollment, educational attainment, marital status, age, gender, access, whether or not they have access to a computer, poverty status, unemployment status, and occupation. And you can get that for every single state that you click on. When you click on a state, it'll turn blue. If you don't click on anything and you just scroll down, you'll get the numbers for the total US. And this map also, if you, for example, if you if you held down your cursor and made all the states on the southwest border blue, the computer will add all those up and give you the numbers for all 4. So I think with that, I'm going to stop my presentation and be glad to answer any questions.
This is absolutely fascinating. Very, very interesting. We'll probably be getting questions as we roll along. Does anybody on the panel right now have any questions for Bob? Okay, there will be questions. Sorry, I had my timer on.
Oh no, I gave back 30 seconds.
Yeah, I yield my time. Okay. Our next expert is Angela Banks. Thank you so much, Angela, for being with us today. She is our own Angela Banks at ASU, and we're so proud to have her with us. She is the Charles J. Merriam Distinguished Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, Academy for Justice at Arizona State University. She is an immigration and citizenship expert whose research focuses on something so very important: membership and belonging in democratic societies. Previously, she served as the Reginald F. Lewis Fellow for Law Teaching at Harvard Law School, a legal advisor to Judge Gabriel Kirk McDonald at the Iran United States Claims Tribunal, an associate at the law firm now known as Wilmer Hale in Washington, D.C., and as a law clerk for Judge Carlos Lucero of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. She received a BA in sociology from Spelman College, summa cum laude, and a Master of Letters in Sociology from Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar. Professor Banks is a 2000 graduate of Harvard Law School, where she served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review and the Harvard International Law Journal. Angela will help us understand current immigration reform legislation before Congress and how it will or will not impact mass migration at our borders. Angela, it's all yours. So nice to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak with you all this afternoon about this topic. And so I thought I would just start by giving a brief overview of 2 of the major pieces of legislation before Congress right now: the American Dream and Promise Act, which just actually recently passed the House, and then the U.S. Citizenship Act, which has been introduced but has not passed yet. So the American Dream and Promise Act, as many of you probably know, about DREAM Acts that have been introduced into Congress for over a decade now, is about providing a pathway to citizenship for individuals who came to the United States as a young age, but currently do not have legal status. Either they entered without an inspection or overstayed a non-immigrant visa and now are unauthorized migrants. So as with similar to the U.S. Citizenship Act, which is also providing a pathway to citizenship for unauthorized migrants, it's just the requirements for each of these pathways are slightly different. So for the American Dream and Promise Act, individuals generally had to have been entered into the United States at the age of 18 or younger, and then have resided in the United States continuously since January 1st of this year, so 2021. And then the idea is that they would be eligible to receive a conditional green card status for 10 years. And that condition would be removed once the individual met specific educational, military, or job requirements. So for example, received an undergraduate degree, completed certain kind of military service, worked for X number of quarters, et cetera. Additionally, in the American Dream and Promise Act, it also makes individuals who have temporary protective status or deferred enforced departure status eligible for this conditional green card status or lawful permanent residence. And so really it is just a reintroduction of the DREAM Act with an effort to provide a lawful status or a pathway to citizenship for young people who are the sort of recipients of DACA, et cetera. Now, as is typical, there are certain sort of requirements to be eligible regarding criminal background checks, and things of that nature. But that's sort of the basic structure of the American Dream and Promise Act. The U.S. Citizenship Act is sort of more akin to IRCA that Bob spoke about earlier, this effort to provide a wider scale pathway to citizenship for, as he mentioned, the almost 11 million, actually closer to 10 million unauthorized migrants who are currently residing in the United States. And so that creates a 3 to 8 year pathway to citizenship, depending on which sort of track an individual gets on. So the U.S. Citizenship Act is a separate piece of legislation than the Promise and Dream Act. So there is a shorter time period for that track for people who would be considered sort of dreamers under the U.S. Citizenship Act, in case one doesn't pass, but the other does. It requires the individuals to go through a background check. They cannot have certain kinds of criminal convictions, so no felony convictions, no more than 2 misdemeanor convictions, et cetera. Again, here, the idea is that the individuals would have a LPR status, specified period of time, and then they would be eligible to have that status removed and just have a traditional green card. Now, what's interesting is that a couple things I want to say in terms of thinking about impact that the conditions along the southern border be having on the passage of these pieces of legislation. One is that these pieces of legislation were introduced at a time when we traditional large-scale migration from the southern part of the world to the United States. And so seasonally, this is about the time that we see spikes in numbers. And so there are not in favor of this legislation, using those numbers as a explanation as to why immigration reform of this nature is inappropriate. So the argument is that President Biden is encouraging by having this plan for a pathway to citizenship. Individuals who otherwise wouldn't be interested, or who know about this opportunity, are now seeking to come to the United States in order to take advantage of this. Now, of course, you'll notice that I said in order to be eligible for these pathways to citizenship, you had to have been present in the United States on January 1st. So this was actually even before Inauguration Day. So at least technically under the law, current people arriving would not be eligible for these pathways to citizenship. I have heard a counter to that, which is fraudulent documents, that people will get things that say they were here before they were otherwise here. Look, anytime you have a law, there's going to be movement and a business that pops up around it to help people evade it. So I think that that's sort of to be expected with any type of legal regime. But I do not think that it's probably accurate to say that that is a motivator for people to migrate now, except to the extent, then here's my second point here, is that smugglers are using the new administration as a way to increase their business. So they are telling people that the border is open for 100 days after Joe Biden was elected or was inaugurated as president. They are telling people that children are being admitted and will have access to status in the United States. And these are all efforts on their part to increase their business. It is not based on a desire, so it is not based on fact, and it is not based on a desire from the individual simply so they think that they are coming to take advantage of something that is legitimate when they have been given false information. And this false information is actually magnified by some of the public discourse for people who are critiquing President Biden's immigration plan by saying, oh, President Biden is opening the borders. He believes in open borders, which just reinforces the message that the smugglers are sending, even though neither are true. So as I mentioned, again, the borders are not open. They are very similar to what they were before he was inaugurated. Some of the exceptions have accompanied children are actually being admitted in to be placed in, and this is part of the challenge, as I think Bob mentioned, in terms of our asylum system. People who are seeking asylum are approaching the border, and most of whom are being denied under the Title 42 provisions that were in place about these are sort of health and safety regulations that led to the border being closed, the southwest border being closed due to health concerns. And so most of those restrictions are still in place, but that public discourse from smugglers and political opponents of the administration's immigration plan are fueling the idea that there is more openness and ability to enter into the United States. So let me say a few things about the impact that might have on the ability of these laws, this legislation to actually be enacted. The challenge is that for those who are concerned about at the southwest border, who are also not in favor of a pathway to citizenship, it is a great way to argue that the pathway to citizenship is fueling the increased migration at the southern border. And so that can be pointed to and said, this is not the type of action we should be taking. This legislation should not be supported. Now, it's unclear to me how successful those arguments will be, because I'm not sure that they're actually changing anybody's mind. I think they are an argument that's being offered by people who probably wouldn't have supported the pathway to citizenship to begin with. But it is creating a talking point within public discourse about whether or not the legislation is a good idea or not. The other thing I wanted to say, picking up on some of the points that Bob made about the challenges that we faced through IRCA, and one was the sort of no real plan to replace the agricultural workers. Some of the research has shown that unauthorized migrants working in agriculture, as soon as they got lawful status, they left agriculture because of the working conditions and wages in those jobs were not ideal. And the minute that they had the ability to work in safer, more stable industries, they did. And this just, I think, raises a broader challenge that we have not really tackled in our immigration system. And it's the intersection of our sort of immigration system and our economic system. We have a lot of employers in this country who really rely on low-wage workers. And who those low-wage workers are have varied over time and across American history. But immigrant workers have been a steady source of that low-wage labor for a long time. But post sort of 1965, there has been no sort of lawful path for those low-wage workers to come to the United States. So at this time, unskilled workers can get a green card, but there's only 10,000 slots available. And those slots are even reduced because of other immigration reform that created pathways for other individuals to come. And so I think in the last several years, only 3,000 of those green cards have been issued to low-wage workers, or what the statute refers to as unskilled workers. And so to the extent that we still have an economic system that has a desire and an alleged need for these workers and employers who are interested in hiring them, we're going to continue to see those workers coming to the United States because opportunities exist. As Bob mentioned, IRCA did not fix that. IRCA just created sort of, a different system by which those workers were able to come and work, and employers were able to hire them. So I think it's really important to recognize this as a both sides. It's not just unauthorized or undocumented workers coming to the United States of their own volition, but also that there's a market for them here in the United States, and that employers are interested in hiring them and continue to find ways to hire them. And that our current, for example, the U.S. Citizenship Act only creates it increases the number of LPR, green card, unskilled labor visas, but only to 40,000. That's nowhere near enough to address the needs that are existing in the country. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from the rest of my panelists.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I see stories everywhere, and I hope our panelists think about ways that we aren't telling the stories well, we aren't reporting well, or ideas on how we can report these important nuances to our readers so they understand. I've been told that we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to not go into the full and impressive bio of our next speaker, Alex Nowrasteh. Did I say it right, Alex?
Good enough.
Good enough. Alex, as with Bob, I've cited Alex's work for many years in my own journalism. Suffice it to say, he's a very famous guy and does a lot of really credible studies. He's the director of immigration studies at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He's going to help us learn about misinformation involving crime and immigrants, And he will show us how immigrants affect crime and how this concern, while real, is massively overblown. So Alex, please take it away. And I love your green card chart.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to be showing this in just a second, but I'm going to have a short PowerPoint. I swear it's not too annoying. But I want to start by begin saying thank you for inviting me here today. And, you know, one of the main arguments that we do hear against immigration in the United States is that it increases crime, that immigrants have a large propensity to commit crimes, much larger than natives. And another myth is that unauthorized or illegal immigrants have an especially crime-prone behavior in the United States. And I'm going to show why that simply is not true based on all the evidence that we have. So let me share my screen real quick. Perfect. So immigration and crime. I think to begin, to back up what Angela was saying, this is sort of an unintentional reinforcement, but this is a massive legal map, a simplification of how to get a green card in the United States. I think it's fair that we should begin every conversation about immigration in the United States with an explanation that the legal system is very restrictive, massively complicated, and only a very small percentage of those who want to come to the United States are able to do so lawfully. And this, I think, is the best way to show it. When I spoke in Arizona about 10 years ago, and I gave a presentation about the benefits of legalizing unauthorized immigrants in Arizona. And this nice lady, this elderly woman, came up to me afterwards, and she said, I understand all the benefits of doing this, but why don't all the illegal immigrants just go to the post office and register and become legal? It's, you know, what do they have to hide is basically her point. And I could understand if that's how you thought the legal immigration system behaved, then you would be very concerned about this. It would not make any sense to you. You would think these individuals have something to hide when they don't. So since then, and it was my duty to explain to her, and it was very sad that Ellis Island had closed down a very long time ago. And that immigration system that we learned about in school has been basically gone for about a century now, and even longer if you were, say, from Asia. So I think it's always fair to begin the immigration discussion with what the legal system looks like and to just crush the myth. Ellis Island is not open. Legally immigrating to the United States is very difficult. Now, one of the reasons why people want to keep it difficult is because of this fear of crime. And it's true, we don't have great crime statistics in the United States when it comes to immigration status. In fact, the US government does not generally collect data on immigration status of those people who are incarcerated. This is true on the federal level in most cases, and it is true in 49 states. But there is one state that is the exception, and that is the state of Texas, which is a great state to study for this. It's great to study because it has a border with Mexico. It has the second largest unauthorized immigrant population, as Bob said earlier. And it's a state where it has a reputation of enforcing criminal laws and not really giving people much of a break. So what happens is the state of Texas keeps the records from all of its DPS checks, where it checks the immigration status of all people it arrests and convicts by crime. And unlike other states, it keeps this data and attaches it to the individual in the criminal justice system, which allows me, through a Freedom of Information Act request in the state level in Texas, to get this unique data. And then just to crunch some very simple numbers. I didn't do any regressions or econometrics or anything crazy. I just did some division, where what I did was I took the number of individuals by immigration status, so native-born Americans, unauthorized or illegal immigrants, and then legal immigrants, and then divided by the subpopulation, multiplied by 100,000 to get the crime rate per 100,000. So the native-born crime rate in Texas, this is the conviction rate, is 1,422 for every 100,000 native-born Americans. For illegal or unauthorized immigrants, it's 782 per every 100,000 illegal or unauthorized immigrants in the state. For legal immigrants, it's even smaller, 535 per 100,000 legal immigrants in the state. So basically, you see that unauthorized or illegal immigrants have a criminal conviction rate about half that of native-born Americans, and legal immigrants have a lower rate even still. Now, you might say, well, that's great, Alex. That's probably just because all the unauthorized immigrants are committing the worst crimes, but they're not doing the silly, the simple crimes, the crimes that aren't that big of a deal. Or wrong. When we take a look at violent crime rates, the native-born American conviction rate is about 231 per 100,000. For unauthorized or illegal immigrants, it's 144. For legal immigrants, it's about 80 per 100,000 legal immigrants. So that's similar, this similar pattern holds, right? Unauthorized and illegal immigrants are in the middle. Legal immigrants are the least crime-prone. Native-born Americans are the worst. What about property crime? It's even more extreme difference. Basically, unauthorized immigrants, illegal immigrants this time are at the bottom because they actually have the lowest criminal conviction rate in the United States. This is probably partly because they're much more likely to be employed than either legal immigrants or native-born Americans. And there is a relationship, of course, between not being employed, not having a job, and substituting that lack of income by committing property crime. And then we go on to the nationwide estimates. These are estimates using sort of the residual method that Bob and others use to try to estimate the nationwide unauthorized immigrant population. We try to apply those methods to people who are in the criminal justice system, who are incarcerated based on the US Census. And we get very similar results to what we had before, which is native-born Americans have the highest incarceration rate, unauthorized immigrants in the middle, legal immigrants the lowest. So this huge myth that we hear that's been promulgated by politicians for my entire life, was made most famous by Donald Trump, that immigrants, especially unauthorized or illegal immigrants, are very crime prone, is simply not true. It's not borne out by any of the data. It's not borne out by the evidence at all. If you don't believe me, you should at least believe the US government's statistics on this. Or if you don't believe the US government, maybe the state of Texas can convince you, because their data are pretty comprehensive, and it's a pretty convincing case if you were to ask me. Now, I favor, of course, increasing lawful immigration to the United States dramatically, radically even, some people say. I favor legalizing unauthorized immigrants to the United States. If I were to find some, but I'm also a social scientist. I publish in tons of academic papers and tons of journals. The value to me personally of publishing an academic article in a good journal is very high. If I found evidence to the contrary of these claims, I would publish them, because that would be great for my career. The problem is I've been digging forever and I can't find it. So if anybody on here has contrary information, send it my way. I will correct anything, any error that I've ever done. I will publish it, because I think truth seeking is more important than anything else. And it's also good for my career. But I haven't found anything like that. This is what the facts are. Unauthorized and illegal immigrants are much less crime prone than native-born Americans, and legal immigrants generally even less so. So I will yield back the balance of my time to Terry.
Thank you. Let's see. Can you take your screen down?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Very, very interesting. So, one of the things that as a journalist covering immigration has always surprised me is that it's very frustrating to hear the false narrative, but when we write about the truth, it's not received, because people have already made up their minds apparently about this. So I hope you can help us think about ways that we can get the truth out in a more effective way in our stories. Thank you so much, Alex. We have a Q&A. Should we go to the Q&A now and then let me just finish with Valentina, because she is the last of our panelists. Then we'll get to your Q&A, Tim, I go. Okay. Valentina, Valentina Defects is the managing ACLU of Utah's legal docket and assists in managing the ACLU of Utah's legal docket and engagement across a wide range of civil rights and civil liberties issues. After my own heart. Okay. She is a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of Utah. I won't go into all her accomplishments, but she has a brilliant resume, which they can post. And she's going to help us learn about something that we can write a lot of stories about because they're endless and very human. And that is, Valentina is going to talk to us about advocacy and proposed reforms centering on ICE enforcement inside the country. Fascinating topic. Valentina, welcome, and it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I don't have an exciting PowerPoint, although that was super interesting, and I kind of got distracted and realized that I'm supposed to present next. So thank you, Alex, for that PowerPoint, and Professor Banks and Mr. Warren for your lovely presentations as well. So I want to talk today a little bit about immigration enforcement and talking a little bit about an example. So in January 29, 2021, a survivor of the 2019 Walmart massacre in El Paso, Texas, who was scheduled to testify, was subject to an ICE detainer and deported the very same day. She was stopped for 2 outstanding traffic citations. That same day, when she would otherwise legally be authorized to leave, she was detained by ICE and deported. So how does this happen? How is immigration enforcement? How do we go from a simple traffic stop to suddenly having a person be deported in the same day? And this is the result of many programs, many things that have been happening in the world of immigration throughout the last several years. And actually for the last several decades, immigration has been slowly merging with mass incarceration. We have been merging our criminal legal systems with immigration enforcement. And in doing so, we're creating a pipeline between a person being arrested and a person being deported. And so we have to begin by thinking about who can be subject to immigration enforcement. We talk about having individuals come into the country and having them be granted authorization, but it's important to remember what happens after a person is granted status. And so what we end up doing is that we detain and deport individuals who are not US citizens. So permanent residents, refugees, asylees, individuals on business and student visas, as well as those that are unauthorized, are all subject to immigration enforcement. And we do, because of errors in the databases that are relied upon, also accidentally subject United States citizens at times. And there is evidence of these programs incorrectly detaining and deporting US citizens. And so immigration enforcement occurs in many ways. It occurs when we see ICE agents conducting raids in the fields, but at the same time, we see it through law enforcement. We have the traditional 287G agreements that are contracts entered into by ICE and law enforcement that delegates authority to ICE or to law enforcement to carry out federal immigration enforcement. Because keep in mind, immigration enforcement is civil in nature. To be in the United States in violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act is civil violation. That is not a crime. But we have slowly started delegating to law enforcement the capacity to serve as an arm to immigration and customs enforcement. And so traditionally when we think about law enforcement partnering with ICE, we think, do they rent bed space? Do they have ICE detainees in their jails? Or do they have a 287G agreement? But there's actually other programs that help law enforcement become a pipeline to ICE. One of the most famous that has continued to occur and has exponentially grown in the last several years is what's known as ICE detainers, which is when an individual who would be authorized to leave local jail or a prison is held for up to 48 hours after they would otherwise be legally allowed to leave to permit ICE to decide if a person would take the person into custody. And so detainers are administrative requests. They're not mandated by federal law. And so what happens is an individual enters jail and prison or a prison, they're charged or they can never be charged. They could be released or have plans to be released, but ICE puts a detainer on them and the jail holds them for up to 48 hours to decide whether the individual will be taken into custody. And so there's 4 categories of individuals that may be subject to detainers. And that is if the person has ongoing immigration proceedings, in which currently there are hundreds of thousands of individuals subject to immigration proceedings. They have asylum applications submitted. They may be permanent residents who are fighting a conviction that's incorrectly being used to attempt to deport them. And they're just stuck in a backlog because we have, over the last several years, ramped up enforcement and subjected more individuals to proceedings. It could also be through biometric matches, relying on databases, which the databases do not, they're inaccurate, they're flawed. It's a series of databases, they don't have a central database. And what ends up happening is that sometimes an individual may naturalize, but the database relied upon by immigration does not actually demonstrate that the individual has now become a US citizen. That an individual may be subject to final order removal, or that there are statements or other reliable evidence that lead ICE to believe that the individual may have violated immigration law. So there is no determination of this. This is based on ICE. And so what we have seen over the last several years, detainers were used during the Obama era, but then under Trump administration, under Obama, there were certain categories of individuals that were subject to enforcement. And from there, Trump changed that. And so it became anyone who could violate immigration law could be subject to detainers. And so we saw that exponentially rise. Tens of thousands of individuals every year are subject to this practice through these cooperation agreements with law enforcement. And so then enters the Biden administration. What we're talking about the use of detainers is a policy decision. And so with the January 20th memo, which is known the 100-day moratorium, as it's been commonly referred to, the Biden administration actually instituted guidelines on who could be subject to a detainer. And so part of that memorandum was actually, that's what was enjoined by court, but the guidelines themselves were not subject to the court order. And so then a February 18th memorandum that was released by the Biden administration, that's interim guidance, limited the use of detainers to 3 categories of individuals. The first category is public safety. Public safety is not a general idea that this individual committed a crime and is a danger to the community. Rather, it's for individuals with aggravated felony, which is actually a legal term of art in immigration and is a mislabeling, or it's a very confusing term because it's not actually a felony. Aggravated felonies could be misdemeanors. It could be certain types of citations, so long as it fits certain federal or vague definitions. And that's a very complicated area of law that I won't bore everyone with. Or individuals that are suspected of being active members of a gang over the age of 16. So we're no longer talking about adults, but we're talking about the expansion into 16 and 17-year-olds that believe are involved in a gang. In addition, the other 2 categories are national terrorism and border security, individuals that arrived after November 1st, 2020. And so right now, as the system is operating, these 3 categories are who ICE purports to be devoting their resources for immigration enforcement. And so the types of categories of individuals that would be subject to detainers and these transfers from jails into ICE custody, as well as the categories of individuals that ICE should use their discretion to carry out any sort of its function. So that includes detention, deportations, subjecting to proceedings. And so these are the guidelines of individuals that the government currently believes should be the priority for ICE to devote its resources. And so as we're talking about advocacy and change, we have to talk about the flaws in the categories that we're continuing to rely upon. And so part of this, as I mentioned, is this convergence of the criminal legal system and immigration and reliance on law enforcement. And bearing in mind that being mindful of my time, the data is showing that it's not the worst of the worst that these systems are getting. The most recent data shows that only 26% of detainers actually target individuals with criminal convictions, and not including those with traffic violations or marijuana possession violations. And so as we report on these things and as we talk about these things, it's important to bear in mind that many of these individuals have never been charged. Many of these individuals have never been convicted of the offenses that they were originally charged with. And so as we're reporting on press releases, as we're reporting on actions, it's important to bear in mind where this individual is in the criminal legal process, as well as what these partnerships look like, how the person came to be in ICE's custody, as well as bearing in mind that there is always more to the story, and that we exist in a criminal legal system where there's a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm hearing so many stories from you. You know, I have a sense of a good story, and each and every one of you has just given me great story ideas. We have one question that I'm going to open it up to the panel and to the, well, basically to the panel. Tim Igo with the Arizona Attorney Magazine, which is a very fine magazine, commented that, observed that Mr. Warren said that the current crisis at the southern border is because of how we handle asylum claims. Do all of you agree on this, panel? And is news coverage missing the nuance? Open it up to any of you.
So let me just start out by saying I couldn't agree more. As someone, as an immigration lawyer, professor who teaches my students this stuff all the time, I think one is the fundamental misconception within the sort of popular imagination that presenting yourself at the border and asking for asylum is not illegal. It is not a violation of the law. That is a perfectly legal way to seek asylum. And so the idea that people are approaching the border and seeking asylum, they are being constructed as people who are violating the law in the first place. And that's just not true. Now, as a result of metering and some other things that have happened at the border that make it harder and longer for people to be able to present themselves and ask for asylum, we are seeing some people entering without inspection. But even those individuals are usually not running from Border Patrol. They will often identify themselves and say, "Hi, I'm seeking asylum." And so again, this idea that people who are asylum seekers are attempting to evade the law, I think that's the piece that is often missing. And then we also don't talk enough about how complicated it is now to seek asylum along the southern border.
Anyone else? Anyone
Well,
disagree?
I agree in part and disagree in part. I mean, obviously, I agree that the asylum system's messed up. It's been made basically a failure, like beginning, especially with Trump, but even before that, it was a big problem. But we have had numerous such crises similar to this when asylum law was less messed up than it is currently. And I think the fundamental problem is that we have a sort of cascading failure in every portion of the legal immigration system. Some of these folks who are showing up certainly would and will qualify for asylum. A large number of them won't. And part of the reason why they are trying this way is there is simply no other means for the vast majority of these people to come to the United States lawfully, to be able to work, to be able to live, either on a temporary or permanent basis. And I think it's no surprise where the median wage gain from these countries coming to the United States, adjusting for cost of living, is a 4 to 6-fold increase in income. That is something that nobody who is listening to this call or anybody from the United States has faced from one job to the other. Like, that amount of pressure is extraordinary. And this is a difference from people making less than $10,000 a year, sometimes less than $5,000 per year coming to the United States. So they're going to try to find a way to do so. And the fact that we don't allow them to in any other way is part of the reason why I think we're seeing this. And we will continue to see this. Even if asylum was a piece of cake, much better reforms of the type that, I think we all really want, which is people who are fleeing persecution should just be, let in very quickly, slow burn and approved, because the cost of sending somebody back to that situation is so high. We should err on the side of letting them in, I think. But until we get a system whereby the vast majority of people who want to come here legally to work from Central and South America can do so, we're not going to see a let up of what is happening. We will have only temporary reprieves based on crazy enforcement measures done by the US or the Mexican government. That just won't last that long. So I think this is just like part of a cascading failure, right? It's hard to point to any like specific system of the legal immigration that has done this, but sort of an overall failure to allow legal immigration from south of the border. That I think is the big cause.
And can I just add quickly, I think there's also to the point that you made about no sort of pathways for people. And so they, sort of it gets forced into the asylum system. It's also because our asylum law is very technical. So you think that I'm fleeing persecution, I'm fleeing war, I'm fleeing, armed conflict, I should be eligible for asylum, but that's not necessarily who our asylum law grants asylum to. So I think there is sometimes a disconnect between people presenting themselves at the border because they're fleeing violence, thinking that asylum is going to be available to them, but our technical legal system doesn't acknowledge them as asylees.
And
and
it should.
could I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with everything that everybody said. I didn't mean to imply that all of the undocumented immigration or any kind of crisis we have is just because of the asylum system. Those things have been going on for a long time. Overall, we're in pretty good shape. We're in pretty good shape on reducing undocumented immigration. I wanted to throw in, before the time goes away, a comment on Angela's presentation. And I had actually planned to say this, but I didn't get it into my presentation. In terms of legalization programs causing increases in undocumented immigration. We Center for Migration Studies just published a report last month that has some pretty solid evidence in there that the 2013-2014 discussion of the legalization program that almost passed definitely did not increase undocumented immigration from Mexico. Undocumented immigration from Mexico was very level at about 125 to 30,000 per year throughout the decade, the number coming in. It did not increase during that 2013-2014 time. What happened was many fewer went home during that time than otherwise would have emigrated. So I meant to put that into my presentation, and I just wanted to throw that in.
I think that's a good point. Like, I mean, there's these unintended consequences for border security. And, one of the big things we saw after 1986 and the increase, after the amnesty and the increase in border security, is that it became more expensive for people to try to cross the border. The smuggling prices increased because of the increase in security. It was also just more difficult to invade, more costly in every way. And so as a result, a lot of people who would have gone back and forth decided to stay in the United States for a little bit longer because it's so much more difficult to do that. And then, if you can't go back and forth, they frequently send for their families to come north. I don't have a problem with that, but it's sort of an unintended consequence that I'm sure the supporters of increased border enforcement did not anticipate, nor did they want.
Okay, we have another 5 minutes and we have two more fascinating questions. We could go a little extra. Apparently, we actually have 10 minutes. For Valentina, Tim Igo wants to know, are a substantial number of local jurisdictions rescinding or reversing their 287G agreements, or are the numbers pretty small? And is that decision made by law enforcement or by civilian elected officials?
So there's a lot to that question.
It's Tim Igo.
So anyways, this was a number I didn't get to share. So from the end of 2016 to November 2020, we went from 34 jurisdictions having 287G agreements to 151 jurisdictions having 287G agreements. And this does not include those that participate in detainer programs. And so I think it's important to separate these two things because you can say you don't have a contract, you don't cooperate with ICE by not having a 287G agreement, but still be actively lending your criminal legal system and your county resources to immigration enforcement. The individuals that make the decisions regarding 287G agreements tend to be the ones that have the authority to enter into contracts on behalf of a county or whoever has control over a law enforcement. And so if it's a county where a sheriff is the one that has the authority to do that, then the sheriff usually is the one that's able to terminate an agreement. Well, if it's the other law enforcement or other members of a government or whoever operates the law enforcement facility who has control over it, that would then have the ability to terminate the agreement. So far, there have been some notable counties that have eliminated 287G agreements, but the numbers have not yet been published regarding who is actively, since November 2020, chosen to end participation in these programs, as well as what exactly these programs will look like under the current administration. And I hope that answered every aspect of that question.
Anybody else, quickly? Any thoughts on 287G and the web it weaves?
Yeah, the main justification has been, fear of local crime. Taking a look at North Carolina, we wrote a working paper taking a look at the period, I believe it was 2003, 2015. And North Carolina is an awesome state to study because it has a lot of like urban, rural, suburban counties, very different. And so it was a good like sample of counties that passed 287G and a good sample that didn't. And what we found is basically no effect on crime. It really didn't do anything, at least on the crime rate, right? And that is has been cited in North Carolina as evidence for some local officials there trying to roll it back. So, I mean, I think it's just important for if anybody on the listening in is an empirical social scientist to try to study whether the justifications made by officials and the local, national, state level for policies that they end up implementing actually work, and then trying to hold them accountable. I think that's an important thing to do.
Yeah, and actually I could add to that. There's actually been several studies showing the opposite, that localities that abandon these types of programs are actually able to reduce crime rates because it helps build trust with the communities. While members of communities and victims of crime may want assistance from local law enforcement, let's say that they're in a household with someone that may be intoxicated and they don't feel safe at that moment, that doesn't always necessarily mean that they want that person to be deported, or that they fear that the person, if they are lack immigration status, they fear that by an officer coming to their home, they will now be subject to immigration enforcement. And so there have been those studies. And then I think tying a little bit with what Alex shared, a study that recently showed, states like Texas that have the heaviest or very strong corporations with ICE, their rates didn't show that participating in having stronger programs actually reduced rates of crime. And so the fact is that like studies more and more are showing that these type of programs don't have the effect on public safety that individuals think or have used to justify these types of cooperations.
We have one more question and just a tiny bit of time left. We're seeing, the question is, we're seeing election laws being passed that criminalize giving food or water to voters waiting in line. Do you think these suppressive strategies were born in border state methods that deny the same to immigrants? Anybody can take it.
I mean, I think we have a long history of suppressing the vote. I think, I think we have to be realistic that from the founding of this country, we've never truly had enfranchised every individual that has resided within its borders. And I feel like Professor Banks unmuted herself, so
No, I was going to say, building on what you said, I think if we can think of immigrants in our country as being the canaries in the mine. So, that the idea there was that they had canaries in the mine when the oxygen levels dropped too low and the canary died, they knew it was time to get out. And so I think in many ways across our criminal legal system and what we're seeing here, the connection to voting rights, a lot of strategies that are initially used against immigrants are eventually used against citizens. And I think that's an important connection to remember.
I'm interested in the portion of the question about the suppressive strategies, border state methods. I mean, one thing that I think people don't realize is that in most states prior, when the U.S. had roughly open borders in the 19th and early 20th century with some, notable exceptions, and most states did not differentiate between non-citizens and citizens in terms of voting. It was really beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century where states started to restrict non-citizen voting rights in the United States. We think, that sounds kind of weird to us today, but one of my pet theories that I'm trying to test but can't get the data on is that states that restricted immigrant voting rights, that is voting rights of non-citizens at the time, were the ones that first, the federal officials first voted in favor of restricting immigration. So what's interesting is you have a trend now where some local governments across the country are allowing some non-citizens to vote in some local elections. I believe it's like College Park, Maryland, I think Berkeley, California, a few other small jurisdictions. but in a way that's like an incredibly conservative policy in the sense that they're sort of reaching back to the early 19th century in terms of sort of globbing onto these policies. So I think it's a very interesting trend, right? In a country like the United States, we have a lot of local and state control over voting. You get opportunities to see these types of experiments play out. And I mean opportunities like in the social science sense, right? Not like in another sense. But the study sort of these effects. So there's this like really interesting history about immigrants and voting in this country that is not that discussed because it just doesn't come up in sort of the big way that other groups being disenfranchised does come up because it's much more salient. But there's a lot of history there that I think is worth digging into and worth understanding. And I don't think it's a coincidence that once immigrants in basically every state got their voting rights taken away, immigrants as non-citizens got their voting rights taken away, that we shortly thereafter had federal legislation that basically created closed borders.
Therese, would you mind if I had maybe the last word, which my personal opinion is that people who have proposed these kinds of laws are disturbed in ways that we don't even want to think about. Someone who would propose not being able to give food or drink to someone waiting in line need to re-examine their personal life.
That's a good, but though not very optimistic way to end this one. But it's interesting how many different issues are really interrelated. That's one of the things I think this day has taught us, between the pandemic, between immigration, and all the way to voter suppression. There are a lot of interconnections that we can make as journalists, but we'll have to leave it there. It's been an extraordinarily absorbing panel, in fact, an absorbing day. And I want to thank Therese and Terry for leading a really great panel, and for all of the panelists who've been fantastic. I want to remind everybody that if you have additional information or research that you'd like the journalists to have, just send me a link, send me the copy, we'll post it online. For the journalists themselves, everything that we've been talking about today, as well as in the last session, will be posted online, so you'll have it within easy reach. This has been a very long day, and I'm glad to see everybody has sort of kept through it. Next week, our last session will be another day filled with really heavy subjects. We'll be looking at tribal justice, we'll be looking at mental health issues and reentry issues, and we'll also have a great end of webinar panel on the 10 most important things to look at as possible stories. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all again next week, and I want to thank again our panelists and our staff for another great afternoon. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.